Well, um, I've written a lot about this. I had been an atheist for about 38 years, and I'd been tormented probably that entire time by questions as to whether God existed, whether God loved us, whether he was a loving God or an indifferent God. And I was tormented by a lot of moral and sociological questions. Is this right or wrong? Is that right or wrong? How do you make how do you live a moral life? How do you live a meaningful life? What role does your belief system play in that, or how do you go about being a good person? And all during that period, I subscribed to the notion that God didn't exist. I felt I was facing reality. I felt I had learned this from great writers of the 20th century, great artists, great philosophers. But I gradually began to realize that I didn't believe this. I wasn't a believing atheist. I didn't really believe God didn't exist. In fact, the more I listened to people talk about this, it seemed to me that it was arrogant to say God didn't exist. How could somebody make that statement? And I began to seriously think about trying to go back to the Catholic Church, which is my church of my childhood. And I was tormented by a lot of questions. Well, what do I feel about this social issue or that social issue or this one or that one? Well, anyway, finally, one afternoon, I was sitting at my desk and I found myself talking to God. I found myself saying, I believe in you and I love you. And I realized that all of those social questions I had, historical questions, questions about good and evil, none of it really mattered. What mattered was that I believed in God and I loved him and I clearly trusted him to know the answers. And for the first time in my life, it hit me. I don't have to know the answers if he does. In other words, there are answers to all the questions we have about life, and those answers reside in God. And we may someday know all those answers when we are with him. But for now, all that was necessary for me was to admit this overwhelming love and this overwhelming belief. And at that moment, my whole world changed. I affirmed that belief, and I began talking to God again in an intimate way that I had not done for 38 years. He became absolutely real to me. I admitted that he'd been real for a long time. And that was really the essence of my experience. I went back to the Catholic Church. This is the church of my childhood. This is the church where I feel spiritually at home. This is the church that leads me to God. I went back to that church and I let those questions go. I trusted that God knew the answer and God would help me with those questions when they came up in my life. And that was really the essence of it right there. I've written about it in a book called Called Out of Darkness, but that's really, what I've just told you is really basically what happened. I would say it was an instant thing, and it was also a thing that was a long time in coming. I'd been reading history for years, trying to figure out what happened in the first century, how Jesus managed to change the entire course of Western civilization. I've been pondering all that stuff, chipping away at it as I studied. And everything came together that one afternoon. And my decision to go back was an irrevocable one. I never changed my mind. I was back. I was back with God, back in my church, back talking to him. And it didn't mean that life became easier. It really didn't. In some ways, life became more difficult. But it didn't matter. It really didn't matter. When you feel a conversion experience like that, you do have the courage to go through with the implications of it. The biggest implication was to live love the way Christ has told us to live it, to love everyone, not just our enemies, but our neighbors. I'm reversing that in emphasis, but deliberately, because I think it's harder to love our neighbors than it is to love our enemies. I think we can love enemies we see on TV with an active will. But to love the people you live with, your fellow Christians, your neighbors, your fellow Catholics, that's often very, 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 very difficult. But the core radical message of Christianity is that you have to do that. And it can be difficult, but it can transform you completely.